Ok, we are live. Pessoal, então, bom dia. Estamos aqui com mais um NeuroCafé. E hoje é um NeuroCafé super especial, fazendo aqui pelo YouTube com a Elaine Fox. A Elaine Fox já está aqui do meu lado, aguardando para a gente começar a conversar. Peguem o link do YouTube, chame o máximo de pessoas que vocês puderem para escutar essa conversa. Quem está aqui comigo, já me inscreva, que eu estou vendo que tem algumas pessoas aqui ao vivo. Deixa eu avisar no pessoal do Instagram aqui que nós também estamos ao vivo. Aí. E hoje a gente vai ter esse NeuroCafé sobre o livro dela e sobre flexibilidade emocional. Então, é esse livro aqui, o método Switch, que a gente vai conversar. E eu já vou dar olá para Elaine. Hello, Elaine.
Hi, Fran. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. Thank you. It's very, very great to have you here. I think I'm one of the first people here in Brazil to introduce people from actually who do research abroad. So it's
Great.
very, very good for us here to have this kind of knowledge.
That's great.
And
Well, I'm delighted to be here. Yeah, no, it's good.
so welcome. Thank you very much. I'm going to introduce you and your resume, and I'll read it from your books. Is that all right? So people
Okay,
can
that's
know who
fine.
you
Yeah.
are. Ok. Então, pessoal, para vocês saberem quem é a Elaine Fox, estou lendo aqui direto do livro dela. Elaine é diretora da Escola de Psicologia da Universidade de Adelaide, da Austrália. É onde ela está hoje. Está lá da Austrália falando com a gente. Antes de se mudar para a Austrália, ela passou 10 anos na Universidade de Oxford, na Inglaterra, e ela fundou na Universidade de Oxford um centro de pesquisa que é referência mundial hoje, focado em resiliência e bem-estar. Ela também é uma pesquisadora neurocientista afetiva de referência sobre estudos de genética, psicologia e neurociência, e ela administra hoje uma consultoria chamada Oxford Elite Performance, direcionando ciência de ponta e atendimento psicológico para pessoas. Vocês não têm ideia com quem estamos falando aqui. Oi, pessoal, good morning. So, Elena, I just introduced you. We have some people actually alive on Instagram, but I don't think they can see you. They can see only me.
Oh, okay.
But actually, you have quite a history in research in psychology, right?
Yes, yeah. I've been around for quite a while now, so I've got quite a lot of experience over the years. Yeah, in psychology.
And it's so now you are in Australia, right?
That's right. I moved to Australia about just under 2 years ago. I was at the University of Oxford for a long time before that. Yeah.
Okay, that's very nice. So you're actually very, very far from us. What time is in Australia right now?
It's about 8:30 in the evening.
And here's 7 a.m., guys. So
yeah, sorry to get you up so early. I know it's early over there.
No, they're actually saying thank you for the opportunity. So a lot of people that what they do is they wake up, get their coffee. Sometimes they drive to work, watching us or listening to the program. We have some people on Instagram here too. They don't know we're on YouTube. Let here. So Elaine, we're going to talk today about your book, which has been released in Brazil a few months ago,
That's
which
right,
is
yeah.
a Método Switch. That's the name in Portuguese, right? In English, it's Switchcraft, right?
Yes.
Why that name? Why did you choose this name?
Well, I think I had a lot of different names. I had names like the flexible mind, flexibility, emotional, mental flexibility. And it was actually my husband, Kevin, who's also a psychologist and writes, and he's very, very good at titles. So he kind of asked me one day, he said, well, what really is the book about? What really is in a nutshell, what's the book about? And I said, well, it's really about, the idea that there are some times in life where we need to be very persistent, and it's a very good thing to be gritty and persistent and keep going. But there are some times when actually being persistent is not the right thing. Sometimes, we need to be much more flexible. And so I kind of said, sometimes we need to stick with what we're doing. That's the right thing. But sometimes we need to switch. So he actually suggested, well, what about switchcraft? Like looking at the craft of switching and that art of getting the sense of knowing when the right thing to do is. Like sometimes it's right to stick with what you're doing and be persistent. Other times you need to really change and do something a bit different. So switchcraft just seemed in English, it kind of works quite well, I think, as the, as that ability to like, when do you stick, when do you switch?
I think it's very important for us to be able to discuss that, because as we see today in many courses we have, and even online courses from psychologists and non-psychologists, usually what we see is people telling us, no, you have to stick to your decisions and you have to stick to only way of being and existing and thinking in order
Yeah,
to succeed, right? Have you seen that?
exactly.
And it's very different from the fact that you're presenting to us that no, actually being able to switch and change between decisions and between pressure times is actually very important for our mental health. Is that it?
It's really important, yeah, because I think we all know, and all of us ourselves can end up getting very stuck in habits, if you like. We get very rigid in how we think and how we feel, and often I'm sure all of us have had that experience of you're trying to solve some problem and you keep trying the same thing over and over again, and it's just not working. The outcome is the same every time. So sometimes it's you look at the world around you and you realize actually there's a different way of doing this. Maybe my family have always done things in a certain way. Maybe I've always done certain things in a certain way. But sometimes that may not be the right way. And that's what Switchcraft is about, really. It's about stepping back a bit and really looking at the situation you're in and finding out what is the best thing to do in that situation. And it may not be comfortable for you. It may be something you're not particularly comfortable doing. But I kind of discovered that in a lot of research, that sometimes some people were very good at identifying when they needed to change and do something different, but they just couldn't bring themselves to do it. And the important thing about Switchcraft is it's not just changing for the sake of changing. It's not just
Yeah.
changing because you can change. It's changing when it's appropriate to the situation. That's really the key. So I give an example in the book of golf. So I don't know whether people play golf a lot in Brazil, but we all know that when you see people going out onto the golf course, they have about 14 different clubs, different types of clubs. And that's because the challenges they face on different parts of the golf club are quite different. Sometimes they'll have to hit very long shots. Sometimes they'll be stuck in a bunker and they'll have to have a particular type of club to get out of that. Sometimes they're in rough grass. So you need lots of different clubs. If you had one club only, you'd be very good at certain types of shots, but really bad at all the other types of shots.
Really?
And yeah, so, I kind of use that analogy to say it's a bit like that in life, really. We all have lots of different strategies, and we might have our preferred strategies and preferred ways of doing things. But actually, life throws us lots of very different types of problems. So the idea that only one solution is going to be good for everything it just doesn't work. So even though in psychology we've got a lot of very good evidence-based techniques, so we've got things like mindfulness, growth mindset. I'm sure your audience know a lot of these things. And all of these have a lot of evidence, but none of them are good for every single situation you're likely to be in. Some of them are very good, like mindfulness can be very good when you want to regulate your emotions, control your emotions, calm yourself a bit. But there are some situations where it's absolutely the wrong choice. So that's really what Switchcraft is about. It's about you're really understanding that there is no one size fits all. I don't know whether that's a phrase in English. I'm not sure whether you have it in Brazil, but it's the idea that like no one size fits everything. So, and I think that's really, we sometimes forget that, and we often are trying to look for the one secret or the one technique that's going to solve all our problems. And the argument I make in the book really is that actually there isn't one. What we need is kind of a diversity of mind, if you like, lots of different strategies, lots of different ways of dealing with situations, and then developing that technique of picking the right one for the right context you're in.
Yeah. So is this why you wrote the book? Because you saw there was a gap in the literature or in everyday skills that we actually were trying to use only one thing? And why did you write the book? Was that why?
It was interesting. It came initially quite a number of years ago. Initially, it came from my research, and then I began seeing the same kind of thing. And just when I was doing executive coaching with people and sports people, for example, but in my research. So if I could just go back a bit, for a long time I studied cognitive biases in anxiety, in particular. So when people are very anxious, we know they tend to pay more attention to negative information. They zone into the negative stories in the newspaper, for example. Also, if you have in the social world, we have lots of ambiguities. People might make a comment about something, and it's very easy to interpret that in a more negative way or a more positive way. So again, anxious people tend to have very negative biases there. So if something is ambiguous, they'll always take the worst case scenario. They'll take a more negative scenario. And the same in memory. When we recall things that happened in the past, people who are prone to anxiety and depression will tend to remember more negative material than more positive material. So, I fell into the trap myself of thinking a bit rigidly, because for many years, I was working for years and years on this, looking at attentional biases and negative cognitive biases, and thinking this is the problem with anxiety. People have this negative biases. So we developed a lot of computerized training techniques to try and shift those biases. And that we have some evidence that if you shift a negative bias, you get improvements in anxiety. And so I'd kind of fallen into the trap, like a lot of other scientists, of thinking the negative bias is the problem. And then suddenly one day I had a real insight. So some colleagues of mine did some work with soldiers, with military people in the military. And they realized that actually for them, negative biases are really appropriate. If you're in a genuinely dangerous situation, if you're going into a potentially a war situation, you need to be very vigilant for threat. You need to be very biased towards threat. And of course, there are lots of situations in life like that. If you're lying in bed late at night and you hear what you think is a window breaking, that could be a burglar, it could be somebody breaking in. So it makes sense to be very vigilant. Is it a potential threat? So what I kind of realized was that when we started looking at this, with anxious people, it turns out that it wasn't the negative bias itself that was the problem, really. It was the inflexibility of the bias. So what happens is, for most of us, we can get a very negative bias in a threatening situation. But when we're in a safe situation, when we're with our friends or we're at home or we're within a familiar, safe kind of environment, those biases get switched off and we can relax and we're not necessarily thinking negatively. But the problem with anxious people is that they have these negative biases when there's a threatening situation. But the problem is they also have these biases when they're in a very safe situation. So in other words, I suddenly realized it's actually the inflexibility of the biases is the problem, not the biases itself. These biases are actually quite functional and they work well for us in certain situations. But for anxious people, they just can't switch them off, really. So I kind of realized it's actually that inflexibility and so we started trying to think of ways we could kind of measure that inflexibility. And then at the same time, I was doing a lot of research on resilience in young children. So we were looking at school-age children, like teenagers, 12 and 13 years old. And I was looking at those who are more resilient. And what was coming through really clearly was that the more resilient kids were really adaptable. They were the kind of kids who tried out different things. They were flexible. They tried one thing, and if it didn't work, they'd jump to another thing. Whereas the anxious kind of children, the more anxious children, tended to be really focused on the same thing. They would keep trying to do things in the same way all the time. So I began to just see all around, really, and also with some of the sports people that I was kind of coaching and involved with. So I was working with a group of elite athletes who were in the Olympics, for example. And I noticed that a lot of those got into very rigid patterns about their training methods. So one guy in particular, for example, was constantly getting himself injured because he just kept doing his normal training schedule, even when he could feel an injury coming on. He didn't kind of change his schedule, or he didn't tell his coach, because he wanted to do his training. And of course, what would then happen is he'd get a bad injury and then he'd be out for weeks. So we had to work really hard with him to say, look, you need to be really aware of your body. And if you are developing an injury, actually, you need to scale things down, or maybe do some swimming instead of running, and, just do something different that's not going to exacerbate that injury. So I think all around, I kind of suddenly began to see this, a lot of the time, it's the inflexibility or rigidity is the problem. So none of the biases in themselves are necessarily bad, but it's just if you're very inflexible in those biases. So it kind of came from all of that. I mean, it's a bit of a long answer to your question, but all of that, I kind of realized that actually this flexibility is really important, and that's really at the heart of everything. So that's kind of why I was interested in writing the book. So a lot of people think I wrote the book in response to the pandemic, but actually I started way before that, because I'd kind of, and as I said, it came mainly from my own research interest, and suddenly realizing that actually all of the biases I was studying, and always assuming that the bias itself was the problem, and then suddenly realizing actually it's not the bias that's the problem. It's just if you can't implement that bias effectively, depending on the situation you're in, that's the real problem.
Okay, that's very interesting, because actually I think this is quite new for everyone. And emotional flexibility, is this the name you're given, emotional flexibility, or just flexibility?
I think it's one of the confusing things in psychology. We're very good in psychology, as you know, Fran, about, of having lots of different concepts that have different names but are actually very similar to each other. And I think with it, and that's why I've used the word kind of mental flexibility or mental agility, because I think there's different levels. We have emotional flexibility, which we know is it's the ability to really regulate our emotions depending on the kind of situation we're in.
Yeah.
But we also have cognitive flexibility.
Yeah.
Which is there are techniques which I'm sure you're familiar with in psychology, which are called task switching techniques, where you have to shift very quickly from one task to the other. And what you find is the bigger the delay when you're shifting from one thing to the other. So to give you an example, the simplest situation is you present a number of digits on a computer screen. So like say digits between 1 and 70. And if the digit appears in red, people have to say, is it an odd or an even number? So they press the button if it's odd or even. Whereas if the digit appears in blue, they have to say, is it above or below 20, say. So in other words, you might be going along, you're saying odd, even, odd, even, odd, even. Suddenly it appears in a different color, and you now have to say above or below 20. So that kind of switch, we can measure the amount of flexibility you have at a cognitive level by just measuring the delay, because it just takes people a little bit of time to shift to the new mindset. So that kind of cognitive flexibility is slightly different from the emotional flexibility.
Yeah.
So there's lots of different types. So and when in Switchcraft, I'm trying to cover all of it really, in a sense, because we also have flexibility in terms of our coping strategies, which may be emotional flexibility, but may be something different as well. And as I was mentioning, it's a bit harder to measure, but the idea of being flexible with biases as well is another form of flexibility. So some people are very good at, switching on very negative biases very quickly if they're in a genuinely threatening situation, whereas they can very easily switch them off when they're in a less threatening situation. So I think, there's lots of different types of flexibility in psychology. And so in Switchcraft, I'm trying to kind of capture all of them, because I think there's a core element of all of them, but with slight differences between them. But it can get very confusing when you look at the literature. It can get a bit confusing because we just think it's just one thing, but actually there's probably at least 4 or 5 different kind of concepts that have been talked about that are all about flexibility in one level. But sometimes it's flexibility in our mental thinking, how quickly we can shift from one thought to the other. Sometimes it's more emotional flexibility. Sometimes it's more flexibility with these kind of biases we've been talking about. So, so we're in the book, I'm trying to kind of cover all of them really.
Yeah. Which in everyday life, it's actually what people want and what will help them, right? Because
Exactly.
the concepts help us doing our research, or even in the lab, or trying to understand why is this person more anxious than the other one. Maybe he has one kind of flexibility, but he doesn't have the other kind of. But then at real life, every day, people just want to feel better and cope with life.
Exactly, that's right. And
way. Yeah.
Exactly. And life is very complex. It's not, sometimes in psychology, we try and have these very clear concepts, but the reality is life is a bit messy. And it's, and as I said, that's really at the heart of the book, is that message that there is no one size fits all. So we need to have a kind of diversity of, different strategies, different ways to cope with things. And as we were saying, have the ability to switch when you need to, when the situation calls for it, really.
Yeah, I think this is actually so important, because what people actually ask me all the time, because I work with emotion and cognitive regulation, so they ask me constantly, what's the best technique for depression? What's the best technique for, I don't know, for doing a test?
Yes.
And then also I always say, there is no best technique for anything. It depends on so many things, on who you are, how you react.
Absolutely.
You have to know about how and then you have to develop a flexible way of being. And that's what the book's about, right? You teach, it's kind of a method. Can we call it because the name of the book in Portuguese is Method, the method switch.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it is. So I try to give lots of tips and lots of techniques of how to switch and how to improve your flexibility in those different types of things. Like sometimes it's emotional flexibility, sometimes it's a more cognitive type of flexibility, a switching mindset very quickly. So I give a few different techniques and methods to help people do that.
Yeah, and I see here, so I'm gonna go over the book and say some things in Portuguese, so people will understand what they will find in the book. But I see here, you have a questionnaire with a few questions. Pessoal, no livro tem questionário com algumas perguntas para ver se você tem flexibilidade mental. So is this questionnaire for real? is this good for us? Is it gonna tell us how we work or what we have to work on?
Yes, I think so. This is the mental flexibility questionnaire, is it? Because I've got lots of different.
There's a few questionnaires actually. There are two. Yeah, that's the first one. The mental.
There's a couple of different ones in there, but it's the mental flexibility one tries to actually capture all of those different types of flexibility we talked about. So some questions relate more to mental flexibility, some relate more to emotional flexibility. So I think it just gives people a good sense of how flexible or rigid. If you answer it honestly and you're really ruthlessly honest with yourself and answer it, a lot of people are surprised. They find actually I'm much more inflexible than maybe I thought I was. And so I know some people have used the book by doing the questionnaire pretty soon before they start reading it. And then once they start doing some of the exercises, they can test themselves again to see actually have things changed at all. You have to kind of, have you changed? So hopefully it is useful. It just gives people a snapshot of how flexible they might be, just naturally.
Yeah. And then there's also, you talk a bit about uncertainty, and there's a questionnaire about how do you deal with uncertainty. And this is something I've talked about in my channels because Brazil is a very uncertain country. So economically, politically, even religiously, sometimes we go to one way and all of a sudden everything changes. So companies in Brazil also change strategies very, very often.
Yes.
It's very, very stressful for people who live here.
Yes.
How do you think dealing with uncertainty is actually important to be flexible?
It's really, really important. And I think it's kind of really at the heart of Switchcraft, really, because if you think about it, the world is very uncertain, and it always has been. We feel, a lot of people feel things are more uncertain now after the coronavirus pandemic and everything. But actually, if we think back through our ancestors, many generations have had wars, they've had earthquakes, there's all sorts of uncertainty. And even in our personal lives, we never quite know if friends are going to get ill, if we're going to get ill, things would happen. We might lose our job, all sorts of things can happen. So I think the first thing is to really kind of, I suppose, try and develop a sense of acceptance that this is actually normal. It's not, I think we often think of uncertainty as, this is, for example, as you know, Fran, I'm in a university here in Adelaide at the moment, and we're going through a merger with another university that's kind of more or less next door. And of course, a lot of people are very resistant to that change. Suddenly, we've got these two very different universities that are now kind of joining together. And it's created a lot of uncertainty. No one really quite knows how it's going to work out. So I think, first of all, just kind of almost accepting, well, this is just normal life. Life is always changing. We never quite know, when things are going to change. So we can't really expect things to stay the same for all of our lives. Even over a year or two, things will change. So that kind of acceptance to really kind of allow yourself to feel that uncertainty and almost to kind of normalize it is kind of really important, I think. And also just to realize, none of us are fortune tellers. We can't predict the future perfectly. So I think a lot of people, so I've worked with a lot of people who really kind of beat themselves up a bit because they didn't predict some change was going to happen. But we're not fortune tellers. We can obviously try and do all sorts of analysis and try and predict what might happen. And of course, our brain loves that. So I talk a lot in the book about our brain is really a prediction machine. We used to think that the brain worked by, something would happen in the world and then we'd react to that. Now we know it actually works in the opposite way. The brain actually predicts what is likely to happen next. And then we get what's called, if things work out as predicted, then that's fine. If it doesn't work out as predicted, we get what's called a prediction error. And that's how the brain learns, basically. So the brain thinks, okay, so even something simple like if you're picking up a coffee cup, if you misjudge it slightly, the brain predicts, okay, you need to move your hand a certain distance. If that's a slight error, you get this error signal in the brain. And the problem is, in times of uncertainty, the brain is sending out lots of error signals. So, there's lots of things that aren't predictable, and that gets really draining. So it's a funny thing. I talk about it in the book. It's a paradox, really, in that our brain is designed to be very flexible, and because it's a prediction machine, really, it's designed to be very flexible. But at the same time, predicting things actually takes up a lot of energy in the brain. So the brain uses a lot of glucose and uses a lot of energy. So the brain tries to persuade us to stick to routine and stick to habits because that's less draining of energy. So ironically, even though our brain is designed to be very flexible, it also leads us to be quite rigid in a way. And the reason why it's important in uncertainty is that, as I said, if things are uncertain, all the brain's predictions aren't really working out. And that is very quickly draining us of energy. So we literally are getting quite exhausted. So I think another important thing I'm sure you've kind of said to people is, there's a whole range of things you can do about uncertainty, but not forgetting the basics. So just thinking about exercise, good diet, all of that is important for just replenishing your energy as well, particularly when you're in a very uncertain kind of situation. Also, there's other kind of slightly more sophisticated things we can do, like setting up behavioral experiments, as psychologists call them. And these are little experiments to try and test uncertainty. Because what you find when people who are really reluctant or who really find uncertainty very uncomfortable, it's usually because they assume that the uncertain situation is going to turn out badly.
Yeah.
But actually, so trying to kind of shift your mindset a bit to say, well, actually, there might be an opportunity. And I can see this happening here in this merger in South Australia. People are thinking, oh, things are going to be worse than they are now when it works out. Whereas others are saying, actually, this is a huge opportunity. We're going to be a much bigger university. There'll be a lot more money. We'll be able to do much more things. We'll be able to get bigger grants. So actually, there's a huge opportunity here. And I think that's the thing, like trying to, in your everyday life, you can almost try little behavioral experiments yourself and say, well, some people would say social anxiety, for example, might think, well, if I go in on my own to a cafe and order a cafe, people will be very critical of me. And, they'll have this strong belief that people will be very negative about them. Whereas actually, if you set up little behavioral experiments where you try and do that and observe how people react, what you discover is actually most people aren't that interested at all. So they probably won't even look at you. So, and so by setting up these experiments to say, okay, let's just really test some of these things. And what people often find quite quickly is that actually the uncertainty isn't necessarily a bad thing, and it can even be simple things like trying some unusual foods you've never tried before, maybe, and you might just think, oh, I can't try that because it's different. I'm going to get ill if I try that. And actually, maybe you go in, you might really enjoy it, So I think just trying to be more flexible and be more open-minded, really, and more curious about the world. But also, as we said at the beginning, just kind of normalizing the thing that uncertainty isn't something unusual. It's something, it's always there. It always has been there. And it's just something, it's part of being human, and it's part of how we have to learn to cope with the world, really.
Yeah, well, that's very, very nice, because people usually they constantly, actually now we're heading the end of the year, and then you have all the New Year's resolutions and things
right.
do and things I would like to do next year, and a lot of self-punishment because
yes.
I always tell people, as a psychology and a affective researcher, that that I love this topic. I always tell them, you know what, instead of just going at the end of the year and punishing yourself for things you didn't do, just try to understand actually what you did, what you learned, because this is flexible. This is the
absolutely
flexibility. And then you can use the same thing that you found out about yourself next year, and then you have something. And it involves looking at yourself, right? So the whole process here, guys, this is her book. The book is in Portuguese. People are actually asking, is this in Portuguese? Yes, this is in Portuguese. It's called O Método Switch in Portuguese. And actually, the book will lead us to this kind of process, especially at the end of the year, at the beginning of a new year, right?
Absolutely, yes.
I'm flexible with myself so I can be healthier and succeed in some of the things that I was freezing. Maybe I was freezing because I was afraid, or right?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So, and I think it's one of those things that, one of the techniques that I talk about in the book as well is it's kind of a technique that comes from psychological therapy, really, about how you can reinterpret things that have happened. Because as we said before, these biases, people who are more prone to anxiety will tend to process things in a negative way. So let's imagine you have a situation like, maybe you'd arranged to meet a friend and she never turned up, or she didn't return your call, or something like that. You might think, oh, she doesn't like me anymore. She's not interested. But actually, a little exercise is to try and come up with one or two different interpretations of what happened. And it may be the case that actually maybe she was really busy. Maybe, she was so busy she just simply forgot, and there was nothing more than that. Or it may be, but maybe some relative of hers is seriously ill and she was very distracted and just got distracted by that. So a good exercise is to think back on something that happened that upset you in some way, or made you angry in some way, or upset you, and just try and come up with another alternative explanation that's a plausible explanation, and then maybe come up with a third explanation. And by gradually trying to come up with different interpretations of things that happened, I think it does two things. First of all, it allows you to realize that actually your first interpretation isn't necessarily the right one. But also by trying to come up with these different interpretations, you're really training yourself to be more mentally flexible, because you're actually training yourself to think about different interpretations and different perspectives. And that's really teaching you, as you say, that there isn't only one way. Like maybe your interpretation was right, it could be right, but actually maybe it isn't. That, and just thinking of different possibilities is always a really good thing to just keep your mind kind of more active and your brain more active.
Yeah, that's very nice, because in the experience that I have with people and with change, I've been working with change management. I did actually, like, for more than 15 years. And this is actually what get people into the healthy change or not healthy change.
Yes.
Even in when we're just dealing on people as clinicians, when they have rigid thoughts about life and rigid emotions, it's very, very hard for them to develop a sense of compassion, even, because if you have only way of thinking and feeling, how are you going to think compassionately with people? Actually, they are connected, right? So I think this is extremely important for people, and it's very good that you have a book in Portuguese that everyone can read, because this is a book for everyone, right? Not only for psychologists.
No, absolutely. You don't need any background in psychology. I wrote it very much for everyone, and hopefully in a very accessible way that, obviously I've tried to give some of the evidence base and some of the science behind things, but really try and write it in a very simple, straightforward way. And as I said, I hope the translation is a good one. It's
it's okay.
Good. Because you never quite know when things are translated if you don't speak that language. You never quite know. But I'm glad you've read it and you like it, so that's good.
No, it's great. So, Elaine, I know you have to hit off. Just one last question, because people are going to ask me that. Is this different from positive psychology?
I think it's yeah. I mean, it's one of the, as I said, the message is that there is no one size fits all. So I think a lot of the positive psychology things really work very well, but there's lots of other techniques in there from very different types of psychology. So in a sense, it's not just about one area of psychology. It's trying to cover a lot of different areas and really emphasize that message that the thing that's really important is just being flexible and adaptable, and really, I suppose, developing a diversity of mind is what I've kind of talked about. So, and there's lots of ways you can do that. And we know that travel and living in different countries is an important way of doing that. As we said, challenging your perspective or your interpretations is a way of doing that. One of the things that was quite controversial, one of the tips I give in the book is that, following people on social media who you're not going to agree with is often a really good way to, and I did that. I was living in the UK during the Brexit era, and I had a particular perspective about that. I couldn't understand why people had a different opinion, but actually I found that by following people who I knew were very strongly, so I was for remaining in Europe. I thought I didn't want the UK to leave Europe. But when I started following some people, even though I never got to the point of actually agreeing with them, I could still kind of see a lot of the time where they were coming from. So I began to get a deeper understanding of, okay, that's why they kind of are coming to that. So even though I don't necessarily agree with it, I can at least understand it in a deeper way. But I think by doing that, by challenging yourself and trying to, as I said, just following people on Instagram or Twitter who you're not going to agree with, it's a way of opening your mind a bit and just being a bit more flexible. And we know that if you do that, and it's all almost like mental time travel, if you like, you're traveling mentally in different spaces, and that's just giving you a diversity of mind. And the chances are, when you are faced with a problem, you might be able to come up with a solution that you've learned along the way somewhere. Whereas I think if people don't get out of their kind of own world, if you like, enough, you can get very rigid in your ways, and you don't really appreciate that actually can be done in different ways. There's different solutions, and in different countries, people do things in quite different ways. And I found that myself. And just I've mainly worked in the UK, but I'm from Ireland originally. I've worked in New Zealand. I've worked in Australia, and you find that in every place things are done slightly differently, but it all kind of works equally well in a sense. So you might think, oh, I've never thought of doing things like that before, but actually you think, oh yeah, okay, that works out. So I think the more experience you have, the more able you are then to just be flexible, because you simply have more strategies at hand or more techniques you can use.
That's very nice. That's very nice. I actually think that even for psychologists, because here in Brazil in psychology, graduation, we still have Freud and Jung, and which I say it's old school.
Yes.
So actually, when you see professionals today, they're very rigid thinking and feeling about that, a way of dealing with people and reading people, and we actually needed to be more flexible.
Yes, exactly.
So we could actually treat people well and even learn new skills, so we could help actually our patients. So even for psychologists, I think the book is very important. So
great, thank you.
That. Yeah.
Thank you.
I already told my students who are psychologists to buy the book and read it. We had a class about it because I think it's extremely important. So guys, if you haven't checked the book yet, the name is O Método Switch. This is the book again. And I think it's going to be a great reading for the end of the year. So thank you, Elaine, and thank you for having the time to talk to us.
Well, thanks so much, Fran. Thanks for inviting me on, and I hope your readers enjoy the book. And thanks very much for the chat. It's been really good.
They will. So the chat will be released on YouTube, and then after all on Instagram with subtitles. People will be able to understand and get to know you better. So thank you again.
Okay.
Pessoal, obrigada por estarem ao vivo. Thank you for actually people wrote here. Well, this is like an English class for me. I'm just I'm trying to learn something, but also I'm practicing my English.
Yes.
Oh, and people are actually saying that they have the book translated at Amazon, and it's actually a very good price here. So people,
good.
Which is good. So it's
good.
People can buy it and read it. Elaine, thanks again, and I hope we can see you again maybe next year to talk about this a bit more.
Absolutely. No, I love that. Thanks very much, Fran. See you again.
See you. Bye, guys. Bye, Elaine. Bye. Pessoal, então, conversamos com a Elaine Fox aqui. Espero que agora no YouTube, quando você assista, você consiga ver o que ela falou. Falamos do flexibilidade cognitiva, emocional, na verdade, mental, como ela nos explicou aqui. O que é um assunto importantíssimo para quem trabalha com saúde mental, para quem é da psicologia, né? Quem já está comigo aqui um tempo sabe o quanto que eu falo sobre isso e o quanto que ela é base de muito processo de saúde mental. E é algo que a gente não fala aqui no Brasil, que a gente tem pouquíssimo, dependendo aí da abordagem que a pessoa usa, ela estuda ou não. Então, ao invés de vocês irem atrás dos cursos de disciplina do final do ano, vão atrás de flexibilidade mental, que vai ajudar vocês muito mais, tá? E vocês vão aproveitar muito mais. Gente, muito obrigada por estar aqui comigo. Se tiverem perguntas, depois vocês podem me fazer aqui mesmo, né? Is the book in Kindle? I'm not sure, Stella. I think it is. Probably is. Mas o livro em português eu acho que só tem para comprar físico, que é esse aqui, tá? O Método Switch. Ele chega rapidinho aí se vocês comprarem pela Amazon. Um beijo para vocês e nos vemos por aí. Tchau, tchau.